isn't what STR does just another form of Bible interpretation? What's the point of reading the Bible if you can't interpret it however you want? Okay, so I sense that the person who's asking this is maybe hostile to our view. In other words, it sounds like they're saying, and it could be wrong about this, so I apologize if this is you asking this, but you're like, wait a minute, you guys just have your own kind of interpretation of the Bible, but so do we. Like, isn't reading the Bible and Christianity just basically interpreting however you want? And if not, then what's the point? Like, we can just interpret it our way, and you interpret it your way, and you just have your way, and that's what you do at STR. So that's how I sense the questions being asked. Again, I could be wrong. I apologize if that's not the way or the spirit that you're asking it. But let me just answer the questions, the two questions here, just as asked, and then I'll try to answer it in the way that I think the spirit's being asked. So STR, well, okay, it says, is what we do just this? Well, no, I mean, what we do at STR is we're about creating a certain kind of person, an ambassador. And the reason why we're concerned about creating that kind of certain person is because the Bible says that if you're a professing follower of Jesus, then you already are an ambassador for Christ. And so what we're trying to do is help followers of Christ, help ambassadors become more effective at being an ambassador. And so we focus on 3 skills: knowledge, wisdom, and character. Knowledge is an accurately informed mind. Wisdom is an artful method, and character is an attractive manner. So we think that an effective ambassador should be skilled in those 3 areas. So what we do at Standard Reason is we try to equip believers to be more effective in those 3 areas: knowledge, wisdom, and character. Now, when it comes to the knowledge part of that, yes, we are talking about understanding the message of God and his plans and his plans for the world. And of course, that message comes from the Bible. So therefore, yes, we're going to teach about how to interpret the Bible, and we have a certain understanding of what we think the Bible says. Okay, so in that sense, that's what I think that we're doing. But I don't believe that we at Stand to Reason have sort of our own interpretation that is just as equally valid as everyone else's. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think that we could be mistaken. Of course, we could be mistaken, because you're right. Ultimately, we are interpreting the Bible. Everybody interprets the Bible. But I believe that the way we're interpreting the Bible is following a set of interpretive rules that are commonsensical, that are universal, and that are understood and applied by virtually everyone who reads texts. And not just biblical text, but any text, a book, a website, an email, whatever it might be. And so, and I actually, this is one of my favorite topics is, well, how do you interpret the Bible? And one of the points that I often make is that there are 3 key principles that are specifically very relevant for biblical interpretation, at least for helping to avoid mistaken ways of interpreting the Bible. And those 3 rules, or those 3 principles, are context, history, and genre. Now, these 3 principles of how to interpret a biblical text, I think, are principles that virtually everyone already knows and applies every day in their life. And so all we're saying is, let's just take those principles and apply them to when we read the Bible. And when we do, I think we're going to come to a very commonsensical understanding of what the Bible teaches. So for example, the first principle I mentioned is context. And context is simply the text before and after a particular Bible verse or Bible passage. And context helps determine the meaning of the unit of text that you're reading in the middle. Okay. So if you have a verse, you want to read the verses before and the verses after to get a sense of the flow of thought and to understand what that verse means. Now, I would suggest to you that everybody already knows this, even people who might disagree with our interpretation of the Bible. For example, if you get a very long email sent to you, I can almost guarantee, and I promise I'm not stalking or have hacked your computer, but I can almost guarantee that you don't open up a very long email from a good friend and do this. Skip chapter 1, skip chapter 2, or paragraph 1, skip paragraph 2, skip paragraph 3, go to the 4th paragraph and read the 13th sentence in that paragraph. And then close the email and say, okay, I think I understood what the person said. No one ever does that. Because you'd be like, well, how do you know what how do you know the context of what they were talking about if you skip 3 paragraphs and then only read 1 sentence in the 4th paragraph? Right? But that's what many people who would say, or who don't take interpretive principles that are commonsensical and fairly universal would do when they read the Bible. They'll open up a letter like, say, Philippians, which, remember, it's not a book, it's a letter, it's an epistle. And what do we do when we read the book of Philippians, the epistle of Philippians? We skip chapter 1, we skip chapter 2, we skip chapter 3, we skip chapter 4, or most of chapter 4. We turn to the 13th verse in chapter 4, and we just read it. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then we close the letter, we're done. It's like, wait a minute, you just took a letter and completely ignored the context. So again, I think context is a principle that is universal and commonsensical that we would apply to biblical reading, and that I think doesn't make us like, oh, we're just trying to get our own unique interpretation from the Bible. Same thing with the second principle, history, right? The principle of history says, look, when you're reading a text, especially a biblical text, but any text really, you want to ask, what's the historical occasion for why somebody wrote what they wrote? About 17 or so years ago, the United States deployed, I think, like 50,000 troops and military personnel in Louisiana and Mississippi and so on and so forth, that area. And there was articles about this massive deployment of military personnel. Now you might say, well, dang, what was going on? Was there an invasion in that part of the United States, or was it a coup, or what was going on? Well, if you ask, well, what was the historical event that happened such that might have caused such an action to take place? You discover, oh, there was a hurricane, Hurricane Katrina. And because of the flooding and because of the damage and because of the loss of life and further in lives that are endangered and the civil unrest, we had to deploy a bunch of troops. So notice we routinely would ask the question, well, what's the historical occasion behind why a particular news article was written? And so we would say, we'll do the same thing with the Bible. We would look at a text and maybe ask, well, man, what's the historical occasion for why that was written? And then we'd go and investigate that question. Okay. And then genre as well. Genre is, again, another principle that I would argue virtually everyone thinks is an appropriate principle to factor when you're reading a text and interpreting a text. And it's one that people apply all the time. So, for example, if you read a news headline that said, "Cowboys shoot down eagles," you might be thinking, well, does that mean there's some gun-toting Texans who shot down the national bird of the United States? But if you discover that headline was in the sports section of a website, you'd be like, oh, wait a minute, I get it. Sports headlines have a certain genre, have a certain literary style. And oftentimes they have mascots like the Dallas Cowboys or the Philadelphia Eagles or whatever it might be, right? And so if you heard, Cowboys shoot down eagles, you'd be, oh, that means a certain football team defeated another football team, right? And so notice you interpret the words differently based on the genre, based on the literary style. And again, we should do that when we read the Bible. It's a principle that we, for the most part, all of us know and understand. And and so that's why when I see this question, well, hey, aren't you just, isn't STR just doing another form of biblical interpretation? What's the point of reading the Bible if you can't interpret it however you want? Well, the problem is that if you just interpret it the way you want, you're not really doing interpretation. You're just infusing your own thoughts or misinterpreting the Bible. But if you take principles of interpreting any biblical text and apply them to the Bible, then I think we could all come to an agreement as to how to interpret the Bible in a way that actually understands the intended meaning of the person who wrote it. And that's important. So by the way, I have an article on this on our website on str.org. It's called something like Reading the Bible Requires Rules That We Already Know or that we already apply. So if you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to check that out.